Taking a deep breath in. Ah, coming back into this beautiful moment as we ready ourselves for the sermon, which the title sounds more serious than it really is, because I titled it A Zen Scolding, Lessons of Humility. And we're taking some excerpts from this book called Novice to Master, on ongoing lesson in the extent of my own stupidity. Again, sounds more serious than it is. It's actually a very deep book, but quite lighthearted and humorous. And so I took 3 quotes about masters scolding students. And so we're gonna dive into the 3 quotes from it today and then expand onto relevant teachings for ourselves. And it's funny because when he speaks about it, he looks back and he sees the light within the scolding. But at the time when he was young and ego, it was just like the worst thing on the planet because it smashed his ego. And back in the day, Zen Masters were notorious for doing anything possible to smash your ego. Nowadays, there's definitely a more gentle touch, including Soko Morinaga. He was definitely more gentle in his approach to his students. But again, it's just kind of like how in America, any of you been beaten by a teacher before? Physical harm, that was a big thing back in the day. And so it's interesting that just around the world, there was a lot more of a physical reprimanding in many cultures, while today it's just, in many countries, it is we're finding a different path, if you will. So let's go ahead and breathe that in real quick and we'll read the first one. And so this first one talks about when he was a novice, he had to clean a lot, and he often cleaned the master's bedroom and office. And so this is the story of what happened when the master invited him to go back into the bedroom. So one morning after I had prepared the meal and given the call to breakfast, Zugan Roshi slowly entered the dining room and said, "Hey, go into my room and from the desk, look toward the alcove." I thought with a start, uh-oh, I bungled the cleaning again and immediately rushed to his room. Roshi's room was small, 4.5 tatami mats. The distance between his desk and the alcove could not have measured 2 meters, but though I carefully inspected the area, I could not find even so much as a bit of dust or a drop of water left from the swab. I crawled around the room on all 4s, but I could not find a problem anywhere. I planted myself there for a while and tried to think about it, but I hadn't a clue as to why Roshi was irritated with me. It couldn't be helped. I resigned myself to being yelled at again and returned to the dining room. Quote, "I don't understand what I did wrong in the cleaning," I nervously admitted to Roshi. "Please show me." "You fool!" he came back at me. "Who said you did anything wrong in the cleaning? This morning I put a single rose in the bud vase. It goes well with the scroll and looks so beautiful, so I told you to go take a look at it. You did see the flower, didn't you?" It dawned on me that I had not, in fact, noticed a flower. I went back into Roshi's room to look. The wall of the alcove, which had been standing for over 250 years, was darkened. Against the smoky wall, there was a scroll with a single large calligraphy of the ideograph for the word "do." Beneath the scroll, a large pure white blossom seemed to float out from the old plastered wall and bathe the eye with its beauty. Just moments before, I had failed to see the flower. My eye had been so tightly shut to it, and herein lies the difficulty of practice. My oversight was to become the grist of my teacher's lectures. After I made this blunder, Roshi was wont to say during talks, "If the heart is caught up, fettered, you cannot see what you are directly looking at." Take a deep breath. So let's really repeat that last line. When our heart is caught, when it's fettered, when it's chained up in something, we are unable to see what is directly in front of us. Anyone relate to that? Mm-hmm. And I mean, anytime I feel any strong emotion, whether it's like, I remember as a child, like excitement for Christmas, and then you can't fall asleep, the night before because you're excited for Santa coming. Or when you're after your first heartbroken experience, and then you're in such pain, all you can think about is a person. Or maybe excitement of when you start dating someone, you keep checking your phone. All these things, or when you're in complete anger and rage about something, or anxiety about an interview that you're about to have. All types of emotions, whether positive or quote negative, keeps us from actually being able to see the reality in front of us. So I just think that's a lovely reminder, which I often talk about. But I'm going to go back, and he also says, if a person knows that they can come to some understanding of truth through a certain practice, they just may get caught up in the practice and find that they are actually moving further away from seeing the truth. Their own heart has become fettered by that practice. And I'm going to actually be expanding this teaching into something a bit different today. And so under number 1, under unfettered heart, go ahead and fill in the blank for heart. And make a bullet point there and put being saved / enlightened versus how we knock. Being saved / enlightened versus how we knock. And I always find it interesting and I like to always kind of share Eastern and Western. So that's why I'm saying being saved. So if you're from a Western religion, obviously there's more of an idea of being saved and then you get to go to heaven. If you're on a more Eastern philosophy or religion, of course the understanding is that you're going to try and reach enlightenment and then exit the cycle of life and birth and rebirth, birth and rebirth, birth and rebirth. And so you become enlightened, so to speak. And even if you don't believe necessarily in reincarnation, at least you could become enlightened in this lifetime. And so we have those two ideas of we do practices to achieve these goals of either being saved or being enlightened. But let's talk about this for a moment. How many people who have potentially been, quote, saved by Jesus or saved by God and yet say harmful things? Anyone know any? And so that's what's interesting. And then because I've been in this world a lot, I've met a lot of self-proclaimed enlightened individuals who then say and do things that are very harmful to people. And so it's interesting is that you find it in all cultures, you find it in all religions, where we do some practice, we give ourselves to God, or we give ourselves to a certain Eastern practice, and then we think that we, quote, know. And I know I always come back to this. See, I know. I always come back to this idea of we think that we know, we think that we are right. But here's where we have the issue where I said versus how we knock. And Soko Morinaga in this book earlier said in a different chapter, he was talking to someone who is in the Judeo-Christian faith, one of the sects of that. And he was saying, he was kind of acknowledging the understanding of this idea of going to heaven and how it's kind of related to the ability to be enlightened and then to exit samsara. And he was saying, but doesn't it matter if you do go to heaven? Doesn't it matter how you present yourself and how you knock at the gates? Isn't there some importance on how you show up and how you knock? Because what's interesting, especially here in America, it might be possible to say that the way people are knocking sometimes is not very gentle, not very kind. There's this idea, I often think of like the Italian mafia, where they're all very religious and they go to church, but then they kill someone that week, or they're doing crimes. But then they go on Sunday and then the sins are washed away, they express their sins, all is forgiven, but then they go back to the streets, the next week, and it's just this rinse and repeat. And so does it not matter how we show up and knock? Does that make sense? And so I like to equate this understanding of how are we knocking on the doors of ourself and how are we knocking on the doors of other people's lives each and every single day. rather than just getting caught up in a practice of, well, I'm saved and I'm going to try and save everyone else. Even if I'm aggressive, I'm still saving people, so it's a good thing. Or I'm enlightened and I know the truth, so even if I'm aggressive and me trying to enlighten people to the quote truth, then it's okay. Does that make sense? And so we want to make sure that in Dunisha, we really spend a lot of time in how we show up in the world. So another way of saying knocking is just a synonym for how we're showing up in the world. Does that make sense? Because if you do believe in an afterlife, the likelihood of how you showed up in this world will then become your karma of how you show up in the afterlife. Does that make sense? And so I also wrote down here, a lot of times we'll lose our quote self today for an assumed tomorrow or afterlife. We often lose ourself today for an assumed tomorrow or afterlife. And so in our assumption for tomorrow or in our anticipation for tomorrow, we might act out of alignment today. And that's the very same thing to where I've met so many well-intentioned people who are so strong with their belief of an afterlife, such as I know certain faiths that outcast their gay children, or they disown them, or they're very guilt-ridden with them because they believe that if someone's gay, they can't enter the gates of heaven, and they want the whole family unit to be together, so they try to send their child into corrective behavior, such as not learning to not be gay. And they cause so much harm today because they are trying to change their child out of their quote love for them because they want the whole family unit to be together in heaven. So you can see how that can cause a little bit of harm if you're attached to this belief system, an assumed belief system of tomorrow. Again, it could be tomorrow or it could be the next lifetime, but we have to always make sure that we're not causing harm, quote, today. Does that make sense? So this is just going back to when our heart is fettered, when our mind is fettered, when we're caught up with this idea of a belief, of a practice, of something religious, something political. Again, it's a sweeping thing that can go into all types of things, but we have to make sure, how am I knocking at the doors? How am I knocking at the doors to the heart and minds of other people? Does that make sense? So I just think that's, excuse me, very beautiful. And then the fill in the blanks underneath that on the left page is simply making assumptions, comma, our eyes become tightly shut. Making assumptions, comma, our eyes become tightly shut. And then the third fill in the blank there, the second line, is the misuse of religious teachings. The misuse of religious teachings. And really, at least for, other religions will have different opinions on this, and that's certainly okay. But in Dunisha, our understanding of misuse of religious teachings is that creating harm in religion's name. Anytime we create harm in religion's name or spirituality's name. So let's breathe that in. Okay, let's continue this journey. So this is going to actually be a quote from Confucius when he was scolding a student. And so there's similarities to Zen, but Confucius made Confucianism, so it's not exactly the same. Now, Zhan Yu, a disciple who was present at the time, raised a concern. Quote, "It is not that I do not believe in the wonderful way which you, my master, and my excellent seniors, such as Yan Hu, have practiced. It is only that some of us lack the power to practice that way." So he was, in the previous page, Confucius was talking about this really wonderful student who he was just living in the dumps, and he was drinking murky water, and yet he was just so activated and alive with life. He was just so happy, even though he had nothing and he had to eat stale bread and murky water, but he was just a happy person. And so that's when Zhan Yu was just like, yeah, but if I was in that situation, not everyone is as great as you, Confucius, or your most senior students. And then Confucius, quite out of character, sprang upon Zhan Yu in a forceful rebuke for his self-indulgence. And he said, "Lack of ability is an excuse for those who have at least tried. At least come part way. But you, before even setting out to try anything, you set limits upon yourself. Ooh. Confucius gave Jan Yu a sound scolding. Everyone will have times when they may want to utter such refrains, trying to escape responsibility. Even I, speaking as I do now about Jan Yu's scolding, was once a disciple who felt exactly as he did. There's just no way. Roshi could do it because he understands Buddhism and he is a great human being. But me, I am just an ordinary person, and well, this is not humility. It is nothing more than self-cherishing self-defense. I love that sentence. Self-cherishing self-defense. And so let's read the quote again that I wrote down here because it is so helpful. Lack of ability is an excuse for those who have at least tried, at least come part way. But you, before even setting out to try anything, you set limits on your ability. And then ... now transitioning to Soko Morinaga. This is not humility, it's nothing more than self-cherishing self-defense. And so how many of us have thrown in the towel with certain things before we even try? Or maybe we've tried once or twice and then we throw in the towel. And so it's really important that we recognize that this behavior is just a defense mechanism of the ego that really stops us from taking great strides in life. And we know that based on such principles such as the law of attraction or just how consciousness works, when we decide upon something, when we decide about a character flaw within ourselves, or we decide about our inability to do something, life is just going to prove it over to us again and again and again, and it actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, again, this is not meaning that everyone is going to be great at everything, but at least when it comes to these teachings and the practice, it is possible for us. But here's the thing: I'm going to invite all students, especially, and even those listening at home, everyone everywhere. Do we actually make the teachings of peace a priority each day? Or do we come to Sundays and do we come to services and say, well, that is so nice. And, it'd be lovely to be like Alaric. People have told me that, but I just can't do that. Or I'm not ready yet. And so my invitation to all of you is that just take note of that thought. And rather than getting caught up in that thought, simply say to yourself, I am capable of doing this. And just say it every single day. I am capable of peace. I'm capable of peace. I'm capable of peace. And when you hold on to that belief versus, yeah, but you're going to see a lot more success in your life with the teachings because your consciousness is syncing up with the reality that you're investing in, the reality that you're investing in versus a half reality. They say, give your whole ass to something, not just the half. Proverb. But here's another really cool thing. So I don't know where this is from or if it's from anyone particular. It might just be one of those Zen proverbs. But there was this story that there was this great master that was going around and telling his disciples how many lifetimes it will take for them to become enlightened. And so, maybe a couple, he's like, in a couple lifetimes, you'll become enlightened. Maybe in 12 lifetimes, you'll get enlightened. In a couple hundred lifetimes, you'll get enlightened. But then he finally came to this one young monk, and he said, in 10,000 lifetimes, you will have enlightenment. And that young monk he jumped out of his chair, and he started feeling euphoric, and he was so happy. Because in 10,000 lifetimes, he would be enlightened. While the other ones, anywhere between 12 to 100, maybe even 5, they were just like, oh, I have to go through this again. I have to stay in this cycle of birth and rebirth. Because again, a lot of people don't understand that reincarnation is not something you want. You want to escape the cycle of reincarnation because constantly reincarnating is actually a bit of suffering because you keep coming back to the same reality. But again, in Dunisha, we teach, enlightenment as simply the ability to achieve inner peace in this lifetime. But in that instance, really think about that. In 10,000 lifetimes, I get to escape the cycle of suffering. And he found joy. And guess what happened? From his response to that, in that moment, he became enlightened. Because he was embodying the complete wisdom of non-resistance. And so I'm inviting us to maybe write down under the bullet point of that second thing, which is determined mind. So your first bullet point is just put 10,000 lifetimes dash yay. 10,000 lifetimes, so that you can remember this story. Because again, and here's what I'm inviting you to write now as the next bullet point. Worry less about skill. Worry less about skill. And more about sincerity. Worry less about skill and more about sincerity. And really, maybe cross out that word worry, but you get the point. Like, I don't want you worrying about sincerity, but we definitely don't want you to be worried about skill, because here's the issue. A lot of individuals, I've been teaching students for 10 years now, and there's always this common idea of, there's almost this emphasis on, well, if I can't practice it skillfully enough, then maybe I won't practice it at all. Because it's like we're trying to get to this perfect skill set, perfect ability to respond. But I'm more concerned with the sincerity and earnesty in the practice. Because when you're sincere and earnest in your practice every day, you are actually going to far exceed students who are only focused on the skill. Because here's the fascinating thing. When you're only trying to fine-tune a skill of something, and you don't have the earnesty and the sincerity of the entire practice, and you're just trying to master this one thing, then master this next thing, and then master this next thing. Some people with that mindset, once they finish the program, they might just put it down and say, well, that was great, I achieved something. And then they move on to the next thing. But someone who is failing again and again and again and again and again, but they're sincere and earnest in their practice, and they keep getting up every single day, even though it's so challenging, they actually actualize it in their body much more quickly than the individual who might actually complete the program very quickly versus a student who might take 3 to 5 years to complete the program. Does that make sense? And so it's really important. I can't remember where I posted this. I wrote it somewhere where maybe it was during the workshop, where we're not so much worried about how quickly we complete something. We are more concerned with how sincere and earnest we are in taking our time to fully actualize it in our body. Does that make sense? And so it's really beautiful, isn't it? And so we just keep showing up to practice every single day, and we have that determined mind to keep striving, to keep trying, but more importantly, to keep doing. And let me go ahead and read the story. Let me see. That's right. Let's take a deep breath. So the third one that we're going to go into, go ahead and write down the word deliberate choosing. Deliberate choosing. Page 58. Let's see how we're doing. Okay. And then this is Soko Morinaga talking about a blunder of his while he was about halfway through his program. All this calls to mind another of my many blunders, one that I made after I've been practicing for some time. Someone happened to point out one of my shortcomings, and I lit in. "What the hell do you know?" And I gave him a thrashing. I was displaying the swollen head that one sometimes suffers partway along in practice, a sort of rust from training, if you will. And so what that denotes is a rust from training is sometimes when we are practicing for a while, we start to think that we know about something, right? And in our knowing, we might become a little bit self-righteous. And so that's what he's equating to. And I've seen this so many damn times, especially in couples, bless their hearts. Sometimes we'll have couples in here and then they'll go home and take the teachings, and they're both learning the same teachings. And then when the one partner acts out of alignment, the other partner says, "Well, you're not doing your practice." And then the other person said, well, the other day you were doing this and that wasn't the practice. And then they just go back and forth. And so they're like trying to correct each other in the practice, which is like not their job. And they're so missing the point because they're focused on the other person's misalignment rather than reflecting on their own practice. Does that make sense? Or reflecting on their own ability to use the practice and to beneficially respond to their partner rather than pointing out flaws and producing guilt and feeling like they're one-upping each other. So that's great. I've learned to nip that in the butt pretty quick these days. But that happened a lot in the past. So let's see. When word of this incident reached my teacher, without delay, he called me to his room to inform me that I was dismissed from the temple. The way he said it was, pack your bags. Pressing my forehead to the floor, I earnestly apologized for over 30 minutes, but my pleas for forgiveness were in vain. Quote, I didn't think it over deeply, and then I decided to do it. It just happened by accident when I was off guard, is the excuse that I offered. About to sneeze maybe, excuse me. It's there, but when you say it, then it doesn't come. Oh. Okay, moving forward. And now this is the master's response. And really pay attention. This is, you could follow along in your little packet there. If it were something you decided to do after thinking it over deeply, and if you then noticed that you were in the wrong, it probably wouldn't happen again. But if it happened by accident when you were, quote, off guard, it arose from someplace deep in your heart and in your disposition. This being the case, forgiving you is all the more unjustified. How interesting. How interesting. So here's the fascinating thing I love about this. And for the number 3, it'll be deliberate choosing. Is that we've all likely taken stance on things and we miscalculated and we were, quote, in the wrong. And those are a lot, if we're able to say, wow, you know, I deliberately chose to do this thing and it was the harmful path. That's a great self-realization. But when we are constantly on impulse and reacting to situations, there's no self-awareness there. The self-awareness comes after the fact. And the self-awareness may not even be after the fact because, for example, Soko Morinaga, when he reacted to that man, or he reacted to the other monk or nun, it's not like right afterwards he was having that self-realization. He had it once he was caught. And then he was like, oh, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. So it's so interesting is that a lot of times it's when our, quote, misalignment is pointed out and then we apologize rather than being able to previously have that self-reflection. And so here's the following thing too, is that if you keep having certain judgments or certain impulses and they keep happening, there's a denial there and there's an ignorance there. We are in ignorance of our deep-seated thing within us, that disposition of harm within us. And that's the part where his master was saying, you know, forgiving you is unjustified because you're not excuse my word, he probably didn't say that. You're not doing the work to actually dig out the seed within yourself. Does that make sense? And so, yeah, wouldn't you love it? Just see like this old Japanese Zen master cursing like a sailor. It doesn't really connect. So what I realized of this is I've actually thought of situations in my life where this happened. There was one time that I yelled at someone in my past. And in my mind, I calculated that, well, maybe if I yell right now, it'll go through. And it didn't. It made it worse. Because previously, I've never been one known to yell, but I'm just like, well, maybe I'll try it. You know, let's give it a go. Because other people it works for, it really backfired. But then in my self-reflection, I vowed to never yell again. And I've been consistent ever since. And so that's what he's talking about. If you were decided to do something and thought it over deeply and then did it, and then you realized it was the misstep, that's great self-awareness. But when it's just like every time you get triggered and then you yell or raise your voice, that's not self-realization. Does that make sense? And you know that it's not self-realization because you keep doing it. And so here's my homework for all of y'all and those at home as well, is that if you notice patterns within yourself, I invite you to get obsessed with them. Just momentarily, we don't want to be obsessed forever, but get obsessed with them and try to find the root within it, root it out. Because that is quite literally how I got to this place where I'm able to maintain fairly good consistency. Because anytime I noticed a judgment come up within me, or anytime I felt anxiety within me, oh my goodness, I would be like flies on shit and just go right into it and find the root. And then I would make a vow to myself to never do that thing again. And that was such a more helpful way that helped accelerate my learning versus saying, well, I'm trying to think of an excuse. Versus thinking, well, I'm just a student and it's not something I can worry about or do right now. And then I make the same mistake again, then the same mistake again, the same mistake again. Does that make sense? And so that happens a lot when we're students, or maybe we're not even students in the program and we just like Alaric's messages and sermons. we feel inspired by it and we say, oh, those are nice words, but because we may not have adorned the robe, we're not holding ourselves to a high standard. Again, we don't want to ever judge ourselves for not meeting that standard, but if you do give yourself some standard to hold on to, you might be more likely to use the determined mind and say, I'm going to keep working on this, I'm going to keep working on this, rather than giving my excuse it every single day. Does that make sense? And that's something maybe you can write down. I do not excuse my behavior. Write that shit down. I do not excuse my behavior. And if you stop letting yourself off the hook, then maybe, just maybe, you'll show up with it much more commonly. So this is my gentle Dunisha Scolding. From inspiration from Zen Scoldings. And so last thing before we conclude today is, I love this, I put this down here, I love this. Straightening out our understanding. That's the fill in the blank. Straightening out our understanding. So when we foster aligned, correct understanding, we arrive at peace with ourselves, with others, and with the world. When our understanding of things is curled and twisted, we may feel at conflict with ourselves, with others, and with the world. So anytime I'm in suffering, I know, and this is like a deep belief in me, which helps me, I know that I am in misunderstanding. When I am in emotional suffering, when I look at something or someone, I can find the root of the misunderstanding in me that's causing the resistance, that's causing the suffering. And then at the very top, I put a quote that I also wrote, is that when we meet each moment fully, practice becomes easy. When we meet each moment fully, practice becomes easy. And that may not seem true at first, but I promise you that it is. And the reason why that it's not easy is because normally when people are meeting moments, they're not meeting them fully. They're bringing in the past, they're bringing in the future, they're bringing in all these added stories on top of the moment, on top of the situation. So when you're having a conflict with someone and you're having a conflict in your life where it just feels so heavy and there's so much going on, the actual moments of the conflict is actually quite easy to address. But what happens is that many people, they're bringing on the whole freaking history of the relationship into the moment, or they're bringing in all these anticipations of the future into the moment, or all these other expectations or judgments from society. And so we're bringing all these agenda bits into the moment rather than just looking at the very seed directly in front of you and watering it. Does that make sense? And so I invite you to maybe just write that little quote down and just repeat it daily. When I enter each moment fully, practice becomes easy. When I enter each moment fully, practice becomes easy. And so if you notice that it's not being easy in the moment, then reflect on, am I fully here right now, or am I adding stories to it? Am I adding expectation to it? Am I adding emotion to it? Does that make sense? And so that's what I've loved about this life, is that when we just look at what's directly in front of us, it's so much easier to respond to life than if we are bringing everything with us. Kind of like the first thing, when our heart is all fettered, when our mind is fettered, we can't even see what's in front of us. And that's why practice is difficult. So let's breathe that in. Very nice. Okay, well we'll go ahead and log out of our video. Thank you all for joining. I'll put links down below if anyone would like to pick up a copy of Living Peace, and I'll probably post an Amazon link to Novice to Master as well. And then we always appreciate any donations that you are willing to give to support our mission of peace. Thank you. I'll see you next week.